Welcome to the AWS Fundamentals course from TECHCOMMANDERS. This course has been specifically designed to help you get enabled with AWS. Let's now understand more about the course and how it flows. Before we get started, let's do a quick introduction about your instructor. My name is Joseph Holbrook, and I'm the Chief Learning Officer of TECHCOMMANDERS based out of Jacksonville, Florida. I've been in IT for well over 20 plus years, and I've specialized in areas such as data storage, cloud computing, and blockchain. I've been focused mainly with AWS and Google Cloud when it comes to cloud computing, and I'm a well-known course author in those areas on numerous platforms. I'm also a widely published book author as well. Lastly, I'm a prior U.S. Navy veteran. Let's now move on and find out more about what we're going to cover with this AWS Fundamentals course on TECHCOMMANDERS. We're going to go ahead and talk about what AWS is, why it's so important, why customers have been using AWS for pretty much 10 years. When it comes to compute services, we'll discuss services such as EC2. We'll talk about Lambda and other compute services. We'll move on to storage services such as Amazon S3 and RDS as well. We'll move on to network services such as VPCs, and we'll talk about other services such as Cloud VPN that we could use as well, and CloudNet as part of our deployment with AWS. We'll then discuss security and IAM. We'll talk about security services such as Guard Duty, and then ensure that we understand how we could secure our AWS environment. We'll move on to billing and understand how we control our cloud spending. And then lastly, we'll move on to a review of what we covered and then close out the course with how to get certified with AWS. This course, we've provided you additional learning reinforcements through AWS demos. You'll find that the course has well over 50% of the content as demos and also whiteboards. Now, whiteboards, I'll be discussing basically a specific configuration or how to deploy a service and walk you through how that works with AWS. I'll also provide some website reviews and areas that you want to look at to make sure that you understand, for example, the framework and best practices. I'll be providing you documentation links, and also note that there's additional resources on TECHCOMMANDERS for those that are interested in understanding more about AWS. Let's move on now to the next module of the course. Course prereqs. Let's discuss what we really need to be successful in the course. As with any course, there's going to be some areas that we want to understand to learn the most as we can from any course. Now, this course is an introductory course, so there really isn't any experience requirements. However, the main thing is for those that really want to enable their learning and take it to the next level is to sign up for an AWS account. You can use a free tier and get some practice and follow along with the demos. Also note there's additional resources on TECHCOMMANDERS for those that are interested. Let's now jump into the next module and start our learning with AWS. Welcome to Section 1, AWS Fundamentals. In this section, we're going to go ahead and talk about what is cloud computing, and we'll get into an intro of AWS. We'll talk about AWS's global infrastructure, and I'll also go through a demo of the Cloud Console. We have a lot to learn, so let us get started. Cloud computing overview. Let's talk about what cloud computing is all about, the history of it, and why it's so important. When it comes to cloud computing, this is a terminology that was really defined by NIST. NIST, if you're not familiar with NIST, it is basically an organization under the Department of Commerce in the US. It is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Basically, their publication, SP-800-145, defines this very well. This is the official definition. Basically, it's a model for enabling ubiquitous, convenient, on-demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources that can be rapidly provisioned and released with minimal management effort or service provider interaction. Basically, what that's saying in English is basically it is a service model that we could use to deploy resources that are under the control of a cloud provider where we're able to scale up and scale down when we need it. Now, the cloud model has 5 essential characteristics, 3 service models, and 4 deployment models, which we'll be talking about shortly. Now, when it comes to cloud computing, it is really important first to talk about virtualization as well, because virtualization, cloud computing really go hand in hand, even though they're actually very different. So virtualization is really the technology that really enables cloud computing and its services. For cloud computing to occur, we have to be able to separate resources from their physical location. In other words, we have to be able to abstract the resources so that we could provision them in a cloud-based manner. Now, when it comes to cloud computing, can we still have virtualization or can we still have cloud computing without virtualization? Well, the answer is it would be very difficult. So the reality is, and it would be very inefficient and probably wouldn't be done, just because there wouldn't be any money in it for the providers. Because if we had to stand up a separate server for every customer, then it would be a challenge to deal with. Now, one thing to be aware of is that with cloud computing, instead of an organization deploying resources on-prem and they control and manage and own those, they pay for those resources, in the cloud, you're effectively subscribing or leasing those resources for a very short, definite amount of time. And you're billed for those resources. When it comes to cloud computing, it was really effectively used in the early 60s, basically by IBM, and didn't really, and that was really used actually in the mainframes, in the basically the CP version of the hypervisors. I think it was 63 or 64, don't recall on top of my head. But basically, that's really where virtualization started. Now, it didn't really take off until the late 90s when VMware came out and introduced virtualization for the x86 platform. That's when things really got interesting. When it comes to the NIST 5 essential cloud characteristics, we have on-demand self-service, meaning that we're able to provision resources when we need them without any manual intervention. We have broad network access. This allows us to access the resources from anywhere and on any device. Resource pooling is really where the benefit comes in and allows us that significant cost discount. And that's how the providers really can make their money is, again, they're provisioning all these servers via virtualization, and basically you're just using a very small percentage of the resources when you deploy your virtual machines, for example, or your storage or whatever resources you're using. And because of that, resource pooling allows many customers to effectively use the same resources. Rapid elasticity really means that we're able to take a service like a VM and basically spin it up with additional VMs or add resources to that VM to meet the demand of that workload. Lastly is measured service. This is effectively saying, I can use a resource and I'll be billed appropriately for it. And then when it comes to the service models basically are as follows. We have software as a service. This is, for example, solutions such as Salesforce, such as using, for example, Office 365 or Gmail. Those are very common SaaS solutions. Platform as a service is really meant for developers to use. This is going to be, for example, Elastic Beanstalk in AWS, or in Google Cloud, could be, for example, App Engine. And when it comes to infrastructure, that is basically going to be where companies can deploy their virtual machines and then load their operating systems and apps on top of that virtualization layer. That would be, for example, in AWS would be EC2 or Google Compute Engine in Google. Now, AWS doesn't really have any SaaS solutions with the exception of basically an identity as a service solution. There really isn't too much at this point. And AWS really is not about competing with Salesforce. It's really about managing enterprise apps and services. Now, there's also basically in the world of cloud computing, there's different roles, or we call them actors is another way to look at it. We have a consumer, the provider, an auditor, a broker, and a carrier. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but basically, again, if you're using the cloud, you're the consumer, AWS is the provider. When it comes to using the cloud, one of the things that, again, is really important to realize is that because of multi-tenancy, the provider is able to serve many different customers off of that specific rack and row of services. For example, if you go into a cloud data center and you look at one row of basically virtualized servers, then you could have 1,000 plus different customers using just that row of services that are basically set up in that data center. So that's quite a bit of available resources to available customers. This is where the provider is able to really manage effectively because of virtualization and the way things are orchestrated and automated as well. Resiliency. Now, resiliency is being able to deal with a failure. Being redundant is another way to look at it. Effectively, if we have one site goes down, can it be routed to another site, for example? Now, in AWS, we'll be talking about regions and availability zones and how all that works, but that's effectively how AWS would handle basically resiliency. Now, characteristics of resiliency is that we could ensure that resources are basically configured and basically redundant so that if an availability goes down, for example, if an availability zone goes down, I should say, that means AWS has basically your services available in another availability zone in case there's an outage in that one that you're using. Basically, consumers can increase the reliability and availability of their apps by using resiliency of cloud-based IT resources. Now, what this is saying is basically if you have a service on-prem, that may not be redundant, it may not be resilient for whatever reason. When you use cloud services, you can configure things so that they're resilient somewhat easier and cheaper as well. That, of course, is all dependent on what you're doing. But in general, resiliency is built into the cloud if you choose to use it. Replication. Now, it's one thing to have multiple servers available or multiple virtual machines available, multiple database instances available, but it's another thing to actually replicate your data, and it's really important to do that. So we want to, of course, be aware that replication can help us deal with, basically an availability issue, a resiliency issue, and having it redundant increases our data durability. This is very important in the cloud as well. And here's an example from MSDN, basically, where you have your different data centers. You have your on-prem being replicated to different data centers. And basically, this is, again, could be a cloud solution or another data center solution, whatever you choose. But basically, the goal of the diagram is just to give you an idea of how things can be replicated and how services could be localized, or they can basically be replicated in another location. And then orchestration. So orchestration is basically going to describe how we are able to take, for example, a script, which is basically going to be something we might automate, and take automation capabilities and bring them together. So when we automate one step, we could automate 10 steps. And when we bring that together, that's really how orchestration really works. Then we have chargeback. One of the things we need to be aware of in the cloud is how we're spending our resources. It's really important to realize our cloud spending. Now, the cloud providers, of course, provide really great resources around how we're spending our money on their platform. For example, in AWS, I'll go through several of the tools, such as going into billing and budgets, and also going to the dashboard and the console to look at different scenarios. Now, when it comes to vendor lock-in, this is basically meaning that if we migrate to a vendor, we take our on-prem and we bring it over to AWS, Google, or Azure, that we're going to be locked into that provider. Now, generally, we don't want to get into situations where we need to do that. However, the reality is a lot of these services in the cloud are proprietary, and we will, of course, have some vendor lock-in to deal with. However, a lot of the cloud providers, such as AWS, but mainly Google, really seems to be the main proponent of open APIs, is really allowing customers to port over to basically an API that's open, that's supported basically from an industry level, that can allow you to migrate from one platform to another. Now, this is most commonly seen in data services, such as Hadoop-based services or SQL-based services generally. But it's important to realize that vendor lock-in should be a concern when you're looking at a cloud provider. And then lastly, when it comes to cloud computing fundamentals, standards is of course important. We do want to understand what standards are available out there. AWS, of course, has closed standards, whereas there's open APIs out there, such as with Kubernetes, also with other data services such as like MySQL. These are things to consider down the road. Look at how portable the APIs are. This will really enable you to avoid vendor lock-in down the road. Now that we know about what cloud computing is at a high level, let's now move on and start understanding what exactly AWS is all about and get into some of the services such as storage, network, security, etc. Let's move on to the next module. Intro to AWS. Let's discuss what AWS is all about and talk about its capabilities and services. Now, AWS is a cloud service from Amazon. Basically, we know Amazon is the world's largest online store and also has its own subsidiary called AWS for cloud services. Basically, AWS provides services in the form of what we call cloud services. Now, cloud services can be used to create and deploy any type of app in the cloud. For example, if we want to deploy basically a Windows OS in the cloud and load SQL on top, we could do that. If we just want to deploy WordPress, we could do that, or whatever we may want to do. If we're developers, we may want to build our applications for mobile on top of AWS. It really is our choice. AWS by far has the largest cloud computing base. They've been around the longest, especially for enterprise organizations, and they were established in 2006. Now, some of the benefits of AWS is focused around having low-cost services, agility and elasticity, open and flexible, and secure. For example, when it comes to looking at costs of virtual machines, AWS can certainly be just as low or lower than Azure or Google. When it comes to wanting to deploy one VM or 200 VMs at one time, AWS can handle that. If we want to port over our MySQL database to AWS, we could do that as well. And if we want to, for example, extend our on-prem security capabilities to AWS or vice versa, we could do that as well. We could use federation, any other capabilities, KMSs, you name it. Now, let's talk about regions and availability zones. Okay. Availability zones, regions, these terms sometimes can get confusing. We want to think about a region as a physical location around the world where AWS clusters their data centers. Basically, an availability zone is one or more data centers with redundancy built in. And these availability zones are basically part of a region. When it comes to local zones, AWS has a fairly new capability compared to what they used to have called local zones. These allow you to place some services closer to your edge. And here's an example of some of the regions and the zones. Now, again, when you look at the pictures here, you could see basically you have the yellow orange circle with little blue dots. So basically we have the region and then the zones inside, and then sometimes they also add edges in there. Same thing over here. Now, when it comes to edge network locations, these are actually extremely useful for a lot of customers, especially if you're not in the same region or you're not really network-wise close physically as well. This allows customers to deploy common services such as DNS, content caching with CloudFront, you name it, at the edge. And this can provide performance benefits. Also, too, that we should be aware of is if we're in the government sector, there is a GovCloud specifically for government-based organizations in the United States. When it comes to AWS services, we, of course, have everything from compute, storage, databases, to migration services, network and content, over to security, messaging, DevOps, etc. Now, there's over 200 services, so we won't cover every one, of course. It's meant to give you a high level of the major services you're going to use. Now, when it comes to compute, we have EC2, Lambda, Elastic Beanstalk, and Amazon Lightsail. I'll be covering these in more detail in the upcoming sections, but let's talk about each of these briefly. So we know that AWS provides services are cost effective, flexible. Some of these services could be elastic compute, which is EC2. There's also container services, Kubernetes services as well. Now, EC2 is basically going to allow us to deploy a virtual machine instance in the cloud. So basically here we're able to deploy basically highly flexible, cost-effective virtual machines. Now Lambda is really meant to run basically serverless-based programs where we're not really needing full-fledged virtual machines. Basically, Lambda is really meant to act as more as a trigger, or what could be also construed as more of a webhook in some respects. So there's a lot of capabilities there. Now it's important to realize too that Lambda is really meant to execute your code. It's meant to be stateless, so there's no affinity as well. Now, Beanstalk is really meant for developers to deploy basically an on-demand runtime environment where it's managed so that they don't have to worry about the back end, like the networking and the storage and the servers. It's really a platform as a service. And then Lightsail. So Lightsail is effectively what's called a virtual private server. It's meant to provide you everything on a small scale, basically. It's just meant to make basically the deployment of services such as, for example, load balancers, volumes, also to certificate management. You could deploy databases on your VPS. So there's a lot of great capabilities, and it's really meant to streamline a lot of the configuration as well. Now, as far as other services such as storage, we have Amazon S3. This is our highly flexible, easy to use object storage. There's multiple classes and capabilities that we can deploy with S3. There's Elastic Block Store as well. This is basically storage we get attached to EC2. Allows us block storage that's high performing and of course local to our VM regions and zones, that is. And then Glacier, which is our archive-based storage. And then data services. We'll cover each of these in much more detail, but we have everything from RDS, which is a relational data service, to DynamoDB, Redshift, Aurora. Now again, we'll talk more about these services, but for example, Aurora is really a managed relational database engine that is compatible with MySQL and PostgreSQL. It's meant to be high performing, has significant amounts of capabilities around storage, fault tolerant, endpoints are there as well. Now, let's talk about RDS. So RDS is relational data services in AWS. RDS is a hosted database service, and it provides multiple database products, and it does support Aurora as well. Now, Aurora is a proprietary solution, just be aware of that, whereas PostgreSQL, MySQL, these are basically open-based solutions, open source. It also does support MariaDB, Oracle, Microsoft SQL as well. So there's a lot of great capabilities. One reason to use RDS is that it is a managed service, of course, and it does allow you to have some flexibility. So what you could do is update, for example, your maintenance windows, review your patches, look at how things are performing, what is secure, what isn't. With Aurora, though, it does have some similarities, though. Aurora is, of course, a proprietary closed source database engine. Now, with RDS, though, it is, of course, a little bit different in the sense of how we manage it, how we can deploy on it. We can deploy Aurora on RDS, but we can't deploy, of course, Oracle or other database solutions on Aurora. So there's, again, a give and take there, what you can and can't do. But most of the differences can be everything from performance to capacity management, planning, you name it. Let's now talk about migration. Now, there's plenty of great solutions from AWS around migrating to AWS. They have a migration service that you could subscribe to, basically. They have basically a utility called Snowball. There's also the Cloud Endure migration service, and there's a migration hub. I'm going to be walking it through, for example, the migration hub and also Snowball coming up in the specific part of the course around storage. So I'll wait before I get too deep into those. And then networking and content. When it comes to networking and content, this is really DNS, CloudFront, virtual private cloud, cloud interconnect. There's also VPN capabilities, NAT capabilities. Again, just be aware, we'll get deeper into some of these. And then management. So when it comes to management tools, we have CloudWatch, which is really meant for monitoring and logging our AWS resources. CloudFormation is one of my favorite tools. It's really an infrastructure as code tool. It allows us to deploy basically a template, configure this template, and basically then build up that resource structure, deploy that resource structure, basically declare the structure is really the way it's done in YAML, and then we can launch our CloudFormation configuration out to the AWS cloud and have a repeatable process in place, reduces manual labor, errors, and everything like that. Now, CloudTrail is really meant for managing compliance requirements, allows us to identify who does what, when, and how. Really important tool, especially if you have compliance requirements to meet. And then we have security, identity, and compliance. This section of the course is going to be mainly focused on identity and access management. We will talk about AWS Shield, GuardDuty, KMS, for example. How do we handle keys? How can we secure our AWS environment? We'll really dive into that as well. Then when it comes to services such as messaging, we have the ability to use services such as SNS, which is like a cloud pub sub based service, SES, Pinpoint. These are additional services that we could use for notifications, for monitoring as well. Allows us to set up basically a trigger, and then basically like with SNS, we could basically monitor for certain, for example, output, like if we get a 404 error, we could have this kick off and notify us that there is something going on. And there's big data services. We have data services from everything around MapReduce to Hadoop services to DynamoDB, Redshift, Kinesis. Some of these are data warehouses as well, so they sort of fall into the database data services area in some respects. Some of the capabilities sort of overlap in little respects here and there. So I've included them sort of a couple times just because there is redundancy, especially like when it comes to being able to basically ingest data into AWS, into like a big data lake based solution. And then DevOps. DevOps is, of course, an emerging area in cloud native development. We really need to have tools in the cloud to be able to adapt and also enable DevOps. Some of these tools would be CloudFormation. Again, having that infrastructure as code is so important. Having build services such as code pipeline, code build, code commit is so important as well. And then also to X-Ray and then EBS is actually Elastic Beanstalk. Having services such as a platform as a service is also extremely important. Let's now proceed on to the next module and now go to a demo and discuss how the AWS regions and zones are actually laid out in more detail. AWS Global Infrastructure. Now, it is really important to understand how AWS deploys their data center infrastructure and how we as a user would interact with this infrastructure. The best page to go for this information is actually the Global Infrastructure page. The first thing I wanted to just talk about is this is a fairly updated web page that keeps track of the availability zones, the regions, the local zones, etc. And it goes through basically the infrastructure map as well. So you can see over here, when I select the US, it tells you the specific region and the availability zones that are in that specific region. For example, in Canada Central, it has 2 zones, launched in 2016. Ohio, 3 zones, launched in 2016. Salt Lake City, which is GovCloud, launched in 2011. And then Sao Paulo, Brazil, 2011 as well. And then you could just go to each of these and just see where the regions are in blue. And then these orange ones, as it says, are going to be new ones that will be available. Now, what I'd like to do is go back to where it says regions and AZs. Now, this page will let you drill down even better than the previous page. And it gives you a list of basically the edge locations as well, which is actually very useful because it just, again, allows you to identify, for example, what might be closest to you as a customer. For example, if you're in the Bay Area, you would have numerous choices such as Haywood or Palo Alto, San Jose, for example. And again, you could just see where that is actually available. And you can see the blue are the basically the edge locations, and then you have the yellow here as the region. So that's all clearly listed for you. Now, you go to South America, you could see that there's a few available in South America as well. And then we have a local zone. Now, local zones are fairly new to AWS. These are basically a different approach, similar in some respects to basically CloudFront in some respects. Basically, this is a location that they have essentially hosted some AWS services, and this will help you use these specific applications like VPC, EBS, load balancing, and make it closer to the user. And if you do want to find out more, it's right here, but it's really limited. There's only a few that are available at this time. Now, when it comes to regional tables, this is actually really useful because this actually tells you, you can see here, what services are deployed in each region. And when you reference this, you could see, for example, the API gateways in every region in Americas. But if we go down to Amazon Augmented AI, that's only available in Northern Virginia. And then if we go down, again, we look at CloudWatch logs, it's available in every one, events. Code Guru is in preview mode, and that's in 3 regions. So for the purposes of understanding what services are regional or which ones are global, this will give you a really good idea of what is available. And then if we go to Europe, Middle East, you can see that they're listed here, and then Asia Pacific as well. Now, sustainability. Now, AWS has their sustainability just like every other company seems to nowadays. Basically, it talks about carbon emissions. They do have solar farms and wind farms as well. That's really the main points I wanted to talk about for the global infrastructure. You could see, for example, when you scroll down here too, I didn't talk about the Magic Quadrant. This is a well-known factor in IT, Gartner's Magic Quadrant for specific sectors. And for cloud computing, again, you could see Amazon Web Services is in the leader category, for example. Now, that is really the high-level global infrastructure. When we go throughout the course, I'm going to be, of course, referencing in the demos, regions, and availability zones. I'll talk about edge locations as well. And of course, when we get into the services, you'll see that I'll walk you through some of the regional services, some of the global-based services. With that said, let's go ahead and move on to the next module. Welcome to the first demo in the Fundamentals course for AWS. Now, the first demo we want to do is just to walk you through the AWS Management Console. This will take approximately 10 minutes to just give you an idea of how the console is laid out. Now, one of the things I need to just confirm with you before you start anything in the AWS Management Console is to always be cognizant of the region that is selected. Now, by default, you will need to select a region that is your default region. If AWS selects it for you, it's typically going to be the location that they determine is, again, closest to you, I believe physically, not so much by latency or anything. So that is, again, something to keep in mind. Now, when we consider AWS, once again, I need to just highlight this. If we want to deploy resources in Ohio, Northern Virginia, or Asia Pacific, what we need to do is select the appropriate region and then go to the console and deploy. Now, one of the things too to be cognizant of is if you notice here, if I go to recently visited services, you'll see that I have 2 instances running. Now, EC2 is what? This is going to be my infrastructure as a service virtual machines. There's 2 instances that are running in this specific region in Ohio. Now, when I select another region like Northern Virginia, it'll bring me back to the EC2 console, and you can see that there is no EC2 instances running here. And if I go back to the management console, Northern Virginia, you can see here that it has the recently visited services. However, that is not for the region that you're selecting. It's just what was selected in the console. So if I go to S3, now S3 is basically going to be our buckets. Now, one thing to point out in AWS, some services are global and some are regional. As you notice here, when I select Amazon S3, this is actually one of the global services, one of the few that you don't need to worry about when you deploy it. Now, you can see here I have 2 buckets, AWS Fundamentals and then Elastic Beanstalk. Now, if I go back over here, I'm going to close that, make that neater. If I go over to services again, I go back to EC2, you can see that there's no instances. And then if I go back to Ohio again, I now have 2 instances. So the main thing that I'm trying to get across here are some services you need to definitely be cognizant of where you deploy. And in reality, everyone, because even S3, we could choose specific regions. But by default, again, that's a global service, and this is, again, helpful to you from a perspective of just understanding the service. Now, Elastic Beanstalk, when I select about Elastic Beanstalk, this is our platform as a service. This allows you as a developer to deploy a runtime environment. So if I go here to Ohio, you could see that I have it deployed there. Let's go to Northern Virginia. Let's see what happens. You can see there that there is nothing deployed in Elastic Beanstalk in that region. And if I select another one like Asia Pacific, a little latency there. You can see nothing's deployed there in Seoul. So let's go back to Ohio. All right, now when I'm in Ohio, you can see that I have the test app, and I could go over here to create a new environment. And I could select a web server environment or a worker environment. Now, when I get to EBS, I'll talk more about what that means, but basically this allows us to deploy like a website or another type of application, for example. Now, that's the first part of the console. So we have here our regions. We have over here is your account information. And then this is support information here. This also has links to the support center, documentation, training, etc. Now let's go down to where it says build a solution. What's really nice about the build a solution is if you're a beginner to AWS, this gives you step-by-step instructions, as well as being a wizard in a lot of these. Basically the tasks are already formulated in a wizard for you. You just basically follow the prompts and you're good to go. So if you want to build a web app, use a virtual server, migrate to AWS, register a domain, you could do that as well. And if you want some more, there's some more here. There isn't too many, but these are, so for example, in Google Cloud, we would call these basically quick starts. Now, AWS calls these basically solutions, so just be aware of that. And then if I scroll down here, you can see there, this is more step-by-step guides, labs, and videos. And when you select this, you can see that they have over here, let me just select DevOps, for example. These are project guides, and they give you the steps, for example, how to make a Git repository to AWS. And then you get started with what's called the implementation guide. And then what you would do is basically follow this through here. And it gives you steps right here to follow. And then, for example, here, if I go back to the console, and let's go back here, that is build a solution. And then down here is, again, the learn to build, actually, which we just looked at, DevOps. Now, over here, that's the left. Now, on the right, we have access resources on the go. Now, this is where you can go find out how you could download to your iPhone or to your Android or whatever is supported at the time, the AWS Management Console app. This is Explore AWS. This is just selected services that they put over here. And then this is feedback as well. Now, I did want to point out one nice part of the AWS service is the marketplace. Now, the marketplace is basically going to be where we want to go to deploy ready-made templates. Now, there's different templates that are available. We have DevOps, migration, machine learning. We also have use cases as well. Now, for example, I'm going to take DevOps. Let's go ahead and look, for example, what's available. So you can see here I have WordPress, SendGrid, and I could go ahead and select the vendor. Now, let's say I want to deploy WordPress. I go down here and I'm going to go and look, for example, for WordPress. And then I could also just make it simple and type WordPress. And now it'll pull up all the WordPress versions that might be available at the time. And you can see that there's quite a bit. There's 168 different results. So you really want to know what you're looking for here. Take your time, look through what's available. Now, the marketplace is basically a combination of vendor, third-party and AWS-based solutions. So some of these will be directly from the vendor. Some of these will be from a third party, just making money selling them. And some of these will be directly from AWS. What I like about the marketplace solutions is that they do have reviews. And this will always help you to determine, does this application do what I need it to do, and does it actually help other people? And when you scroll down here, you can just see that there's all kinds of different WordPress options that are available. And again, whoever the third party is, you can see there it says Jetware. That's a third party, Intuiz as well. Now, if I want to really filter this, let's say I just want to use Bitnami. They have a very stable version of WordPress that you normally would use. Again, some of these are rated pretty low. Some of these are not rated at all. Just depends on what you're looking for. So this is the certified Bitnami and automatic. When I select that, what's nice about these is that it lets you know if you could deploy this in the free tier. And then I go here and I continue to subscribe. Now, I'll go through a demo on this later. So for the purposes of this, I just want to show you what is available here. And again, I would select the costs that I want to estimate, the type of EC2 instance, and it tells me information about what I want. In this case here, what it's really deploying is basically a LAMP stack. And again, it's going to deploy Linux, WordPress, basically Python, and some other applications as well, so you could deploy WordPress. And also deploys, I think, analytics. It tells you right here what's deployed. All right, now let's go back to the management console. And you can see here, that's pretty simple. The last thing I want to point out is if there's any kind of notices, alerts, basically downtime that's going on, it'll tell you here. You'll get a alert pop up here. Now over here, this is another way we get to services. And again, I have my history here as well. And then I have what's called resource groups. Now I'll discuss resource groups when we get to the management and monitoring part of the course. That'll be more focused on that. That's about the high-level AWS Management Console demo I'd like to go through. We're going to be going back to this console many times throughout the course, so let's go ahead and get started.